Welcome to IFA Insights, where we sit down with financial industry veterans to talk about what independent advisors really need to know. Today's conversation is one that hits home for so many advisors. We're going to talk about payouts. You see a number on the paper, but do you actually know what you're getting in return? So joining me today is John Andrews. He is our Director of Business Growth, and he's a former wholesaler. So you see both sides of the advisor equation. John spent years working with both independent advisors and also the wirehouse advisors. And today he's going to help us pull back the curtain for payouts. So, John, let's start a little bit by addressing the elephant in the room. Most advisors talk about their payout percentage like it's gospel. I get paid 90%. But what's often misunderstood about that number?
Ooh, so that's a great question. I think there's probably a lot of things that are misunderstood about that true number. If you really look deep down at what the payouts look like, you'll see that there's a lot of hidden costs that aren't really negotiated between an advisor and their current firm. Then there's a lot of value that's lost through their payout. So I think when you talk about what's misunderstood about payouts, everyone talks about their grid, right? Well, that's kind of the first misconception that advisors have about their payout, is that their grid is their payout. And I think when you really start to look, the really good advisors in the industry, they do the analysis to know exactly what they're generating in revenue and what the firm is taking from them. And if they're really into it, they're looking at the value they get in return. So most advisors don't realize this, but if you actually look at your revenue, sometimes firms are taking a platform fee right off the top, and they won't tell you they're doing that, and it's not calculated in your grid. You have to come to that conclusion when you look at your revenue, and then you see that your production and your revenue are not the same number. And more often than not, that's the platform fee. That's the pleasure of doing business with your current firm. And we've seen those numbers range in different amounts, from anywhere from 5 to 7 basis points all the way up to 20 basis points. And in rare exceptions, sometimes over 20 basis points. So it's important to know what that platform fee is as part of your payout. I think the other misconception that people have about their grid is that they're getting full value for their grid. And this is another big misconception, because if your grid is somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, you're probably not getting the most efficient value from your current firm. And this stems back to a project that I did with one of my mentors in the business. I had worked with him for a handful of years, and he had started to explore the idea of going independent. And this was after I had transitioned to become a wholesaler. He wanted a second set of eyes, somebody that could impartially come in, look at his book, and kind of analyze what the payouts would look like versus what the costs would be to go independent on its own. And what we realized was, in a lot of cases, the firms get those payouts fairly close. But when you're working for a larger firm and they're taking a larger chunk of your payout, you're not getting the same value that you would be from an independent firm or purely a registered investment advisor firm. In fact, a lot of it'll depend on real estate costs. If you really look down at the costs, there's two big ones, real estate's being one of them, and then staffing being the other. And unless you're in a really expensive part of the country, like a New York or a Los Angeles, most of these firms are taking the same amount from everybody, regardless of if you're in central part of the country or on one of the coasts. So it's not really equal to a lot of these advisors. So you really have to understand the costs that are associated with your region and your business type. So there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of analysis that should be done. And ultimately, when we got done with his analysis, we realized that he was leaving a lot of extra production on the table by giving it to the firm and not getting the value in return.
I think that's a great word for value. So let's talk about some specific examples. So we named real estate, right? That's not it's not tiered based on your location, which it should be, because we've got a lot of advisors in small towns. That is not $40 a square foot real estate.
Manhattan, Kansas is different from Manhattan, New York.
Yes, exactly. So what are some other areas that that we see firms fall short when it comes to the value for their payout?
That's a great question. If you look at a true cost analysis of what you're getting for your payout, or if you want to go independent, what you're going to be expected to pay, we've really kind of looked at it in 4 different categories. So we see your fixed costs, which is what you're going to have to pay to host your account somewhere, and all the technology and costs that go into hosting the book, right? Those are your fixed costs. You can't get away from those regardless of what type of structure your business is. But then you have operational costs, and this is the part where most of the advisors probably aren't getting their true value from their firm. And as I mentioned, that includes real estate, but I think another one is the staffing. You're paying all this money to the mothership to give you adequate staffing. And what's one of the first things I hear people complain about when as a wholesaler, when I would walk into a lot of these larger broker dealers was, oh, my assistant, I just can't find good help nowadays, or we can't keep them here, or they leave and go somewhere. And COVID really amplified a lot of that. When we allowed people to work from home, it gave them a little bit more flexibility, and the process kind of diminished a little bit. We're starting to get it back to the levels where we were, but it's still hard for these firms to find good quality staff. And I'll tell you right now, another thing that makes it tough is if you're in an area of the country where there's not a good talent pool, it's even harder. So sometimes you actually have to overpay. So you really have to think about the type of staffing that you want. And those are the 2 big operational costs that we see when we do these analysis, where the value just isn't there from the home office firm that for the amount that they're taking from you. I would say the third is probably some of the optional costs that would come with being a financial advisor. When you're at one of these large national broker dealers, they're not optional to you. You have to use what they tell you. So whether it's your tech stack or your marketing support, I don't know how many times as a wholesaler, I've actually seen 20 of the same LinkedIn posts from people that are at the same firm. So there's no customization there. You're not really getting the value for what you're giving them in return. So you really have to...
Or no independence.
Right, exactly.
So if an advisor is watching this and they're thinking, am I really getting the support that I need for, I think in this scenario, we're really just talking about the wirehouse scenario where you have a low payout and it's supposed to be a full support model. What questions should you start asking yourself to see if you might be a better fit for the independent channel?
So I think the first question is, what are the costs that take it as a hypothetical. If I were to go independent, which costs would I need to be prepared to pay for myself out of whatever my payout's going to be at my new firm? And then back into it from there. What you'll find, and this is actually one of the staggering things that I found through this whole process, is that the lower somebody's grid payout is, the less amount of support that they get.
Yeah.
Which is really counterintuitive if you think about it, because you're paying the firm more from a percentage standpoint than the big dogs, than the bigger producers, which means you should be getting more support. But it's the opposite at these bigger broker dealers.
And it doesn't support growth in any way.
Not at all.
Yeah. So let's flip that around. What's a good value for payout? What does that relationship look like?
Well, so first and foremost, it's going to be custom to every advisor's practice. Every single advisor has a completely different practice or book than every other advisor they're next to. No two practices are alike. So you have to really identify what kind of practice you are. What are you heavy in? Are you in growth mode? Are you not in growth mode? And I think you really have to start doing the analysis. Listen, everything starts with an analysis of what your book actually is, and then you back into what your support level is going to need to be. And only from there can you really decide if you're getting the value you require for what you want to do with your practice, or you're not getting it. And that's when you start making those decisions as to, hey, maybe I should leave where I am now and go find more support, or whatever the objective would be at that point.
So I'll say I've been on the independent side almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in 4 months. One thing I can say without a doubt, and I have a compliance background, so I'm comfortable saying this confidently, is that I've never seen an advisor go from a wirehouse to independence and make less money. They always make more money.
And it's amazing. They don't even have to take their whole book to do it.
Yes, exactly.
Which is unbelievable.
So we always say it's never about the money, but it's always about the money. But outside of money, what are some other red flags that you think advisors should really be thinking about if they're starting to see these or feel them, I think, in some ways at their current firm? What should be the caveats to make them start looking?
Loaded question, Sarah. I'm going to start with probably the most obvious. If you're affiliated with a bank, you should be prepared that the bank is going to implement the banking mentality down the road. I've seen this happen. The culture goes away when the banks take over. And it's no different from, I'll tell you this, private equity. Private equity is another one. They're making a huge push into our financial services industry. They're coming after large, small, medium.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. And they come in, and if you follow private equity, everyone knows what they do when they take over a business. Now, they're starting small, and they're trying to take pieces of revenue, but eventually they want to take over the whole book or 50% of the book and have control over these practices. That isn't necessarily in the best interest of the advisor. So I would say, you should probably question if you're working somewhere that's controlled by a bank, somewhere where private equity is coming in. And I would say the third thing is, if you're a publicly traded company, you should probably be aware of the stock price and is the company catering to the shareholder, or are they truly looking out for the best interest of the client?
Yeah, that's great. We could talk about private equity all day, but we'll have to stop. We'll do that on another episode. So this has been very valuable. Thank you. So we don't really get to talk about what's under the hood, especially when it comes to payouts, and they vary from firm to firm. But I know you love that analysis. You want to dig deeper with advisors on that. So if you're watching this and you're wondering if your firm is truly delivering what you're paying for, we encourage you to do the math. Ask the hard questions and don't settle for less than what your business deserves. So if you like today's episode, please like and subscribe to IFA Insights for more conversations like this, and we'll see you next time.